Money FM 89.3, the best of Saturday mornings. Wide World on Money FM 89.3.
Just yesterday, we noted VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day, celebrated every year, commemorated every year on August the 15th, the date in 1945 when Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, ending the war. Yesterday was the 80th anniversary. Joining us now in the studio to talk about it is our local Singapore history expert, Jaya Durai, who is the Singapore History Consultants founder. It is always a pleasure to have you in the studio with us today. I get choked up just thinking about the great discussion we are going to have talking about the historical importance of VJ Day.
Well, thanks, Glenn, and Neil, for inviting me back. This is my favorite radio station with my favorite host.
You're very kind.
And beautiful music.
Don't stop. And, full disclosure, everybody knows I'm a history major, so I love what you do. I love everything about your company. Let's kick it off, especially for younger listeners, but not just younger listeners. Quick overview. VJ Day, what is it? What does it represent?
All right. War breaks out in the Pacific. In 1941, we get engulfed in it. Singapore falls on February 15, and for the next 3.5 years, we suffer Japanese occupation. The war comes to an end after victory in Europe, and the Allied powers are now able to concentrate and focus on Japan. Russia makes the promise to the Allies at the Potsdam Conference that 3 months after the termination of war in Europe, she will invade and fight Japan. And all eyes are now on Japan. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the Americans tell the Allies they have a successful atomic bomb, and they will drop one on Japan if Japan does not accept the Potsdam Conference conditions for unconditional surrender. Japan receives those demands on the 27th of July, ignores it to a certain extent because it calls for unconditional surrender. There's no explanation of what happens to the emperor and so forth. And so they soldier on. The bombs drop first on August 6th on Hiroshima. There's consternation in Japan and as to what to do with it. Another one follows on August 9 at Nagasaki, our national day today. And that ensures massive debate in Japan among the political elite, but eventually the emperor putting his foot down and saying, we'll have to surrender. Yeah. And on August 15, it becomes VJ Day, or Victory Over Japan. The emperor announces on radio. He doesn't make it very clear that Japan is surrendering, but because it's in court language and he doesn't use the word surrender.
It's very formal, a very formal
court
language.
Which the general population doesn't fully figure out. And so the radio broadcaster explains it in greater detail. So Japan surrenders on the 15th, but it doesn't bring fighting to an end, and that's what creates a lot of confusion in Asia. In Europe, massive celebrations, end of war, all the fighting is over, the boys will come back home, you see street celebrations and so forth. In Europe, in Asia, a totally different picture.
Well, give us a sense of that, because I'm always fascinated about this VJ Day being August the 15th, but the official surrender here in Singapore was September the 12th. So if you can, you've got this strange period of almost a month. Yeah. What was Singapore like in that interim period?
What was happening? Yeah,
that interim was confusing for the locals in a sense that while the emperor surrendered on August 15, the military and political elites are still fighting among each other as to whether this should be a surrender or not, or whether it should be an unconditional surrender. For example, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria carries on fighting till the 24th, when Allied bombers come across Singapore to try and announce it. They are met with Japanese anti-aircraft artillery. So the POW see this happening on the 18th and said, is war actually over? Because amongst them, rumors are spreading through illegal radios announcing that the war is over. And yet they see the Japanese putting up a defense.
So the occupation was still in full force.
For many on the ground, it seemed to be in full force. But in reality, there was internal fighting among the political and military elites. And eventually, the Japanese emperor had to declare to his forces on the 25th to cease all fighting. Because between August 15 and August 24, fighting was still taking place. And when Allied forces eventually make their presence in Singapore, you have parachute drops, you have members of the SOE operations in the jungles coming out to try and meet and hope they don't get shot in the process. And eventually, the Japanese recognize that the surrender has to be accepted on the 25th. On September 4th, HMS Sussex comes in with the British and Allied task force, and the Japanese go on board, accept that there is surrender. And on September 5th, the 5th Indian Division then comes to liberate Singapore from Japanese occupation. So between that and September 5th, you didn't have Allied forces on the ground.
Very confusing.
And messages to the POWs, to the civilian internees, to the local population who were not sure what was going on, was keep your head down. All right, don't create a situation, don't get into an argument, don't go and insult a Japanese soldier because they lost a war, because you have no idea how they're going to react. And it was only when Allied forces started arriving on September 5th on the ground, and people are amazed at seeing these Indian troops driving through the streets and then starting to realize the war is actually over in practical terms, that people start celebrating.
So that was the period. They were just told, keep your heads down.
For many.
There were no skirmishes in that period, because they must have had some news filtering through.
There were incidents.
Right.
For example, the Palembang 9, British pilots and British and New Zealand pilots who had been shot down in Sumatra, attacking the Palembang airfields earlier on, had been transferred to Singapore, and the Japanese were so upset with this. One Japanese officer actually shot them after August 15 and had their bodies buried, thrown into the sea. And all this comes out after the war. So it reflects the tension within the Japanese forces and the tension as a result among the locals and others. So the danger of incidents taking place was very real. After September 5th, you have a state of slightly lawlessness, because you had the communists coming out of the jungles in Malaya, going in searching after, for example, members of the local militia who were aligned with the Japanese, largely Malay police.
The sympathizers.
These are Chinese communists coming
coming out, and then looking, and so going into Malay kampungs and having kangaroo courts and executing them on sight. So it was not a period of peace and stability. It was a period of great uncertainty, possibility of violence. So you don't have that celebrations in the streets like you do in Europe because of that.
How many of those sort of extrajudicial killings would have happened in Singapore during that time for perceived or real Japanese sympathizers?
A lot of this happened in Malaya because because one of the first few places Allied troops land in is in Singapore. And there were minor incidents.
But there was a little more order here, perhaps?
Because of the presence of Allied forces in Singapore from September 5th, you didn't have any incidents. But you had them in Malaya. With eventually British forces landing and Allied forces landing in Malaya.
Is that period of uncertainty between VJ Day and, of course, the eventual surrender in Singapore on September the 12th, is that why VJ Day, I wouldn't say it's glossed over, but it isn't covered in the same way it is in other countries affected by World War II in Singapore? What are your thoughts on that?
At one level, that's true. At another level, I think officialdom doesn't know how to react to the 15th of August. Very clearly, 15th of February becomes Total Defense Day and the fall of Singapore and the messaging that goes with that. So it has contemporary relevance for the country.
Stay prepared.
And state support and so forth. In terms of VJ Day, it's seen as an end of a painful period. But what actually it should signify is not clear. And from my point of view, it is extremely important. But also as a Singaporean, my focus tends to be on September 12th or 12th September when the official Japanese surrender takes place. One, it takes place in Singapore, so being a proud Singaporean, I recognize that.
Yeah.
Two, it is the last major Japanese surrender ceremony of the war, last major Japanese regional surrender ceremony, because that surrender that takes place in Singapore is not for Singapore. All right, it is for the whole of Southeast Asia.
Right.
And so war comes to an end in the region on 12th September.
Yeah.
And for me, that becomes the last major surrender that not only concludes the war in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, but in essence, the Second World War. And therefore, it should be recognized as a special day.
Yeah, interesting. We're talking with Jaya Ayyadurai, the Singapore History Consultants founder and head, talking about VJ Day, of course, yesterday, August 15th, the 80th anniversary of the victory over Japan and the Japanese surrender. Jaya, why should this be important to the younger generation? We talk about it now, and you bring it alive in a way that is wonderful. But let's be honest, people that are in their 20s or 30s or even 40s, not so interesting, not so important to them. But as we see things in Ukraine, as we see things happening around the world in our geopolitical environment today, what does World War II mean? Should it mean to us?
A nation that doesn't understand its history is lost, one. Two, as Santayana used to say, don't remember your history, you repeat the mistakes of the past. I am not a great believer in the rationality of human beings. In fact, I think man is extremely irrational. And in that regard, he has this innate ability to create tremendous damage and harm if he is not aware and conscious of what the consequences are going to be. When war came to an end, it was after 3.5 years of tremendous suffering for people who were involved in the campaign. Why does it come about? It comes about because of the great contestation between Japan, an emerging power, and the Western allies trying to change the status quo in the region in search of natural resources like oil. All right, the Japanese went to war because the Americans imposed and the Allies imposed total economic sanctions. They knew within 1 year they would run out of oil, and that war in China would go very badly against them because they would not have the oil to defend themselves or to prosecute a war. So for them, the state of the nation was facing an existential threat. And therefore, they invade Southeast Asia, and particularly Sumatra, because Sumatra offered all the oil they needed. All right, so they go to war for resources. In so many ways, the tensions of those 1920s and 30s, and then which eventually explodes, all right, in 1941, are very reflective of our times today.
Yep.
Take out Japan, put in China, put in the United States, put in the West. You have a similar dramatic situation unfolding, not only in East Asia and Taiwan, but in the South China Sea. And as a result, you're seeing tensions being bracked up and similar problems and issues developing again. So one, you need to understand the cost of war. And while we as human beings are supposed to be rational, drifting into war is a very common aspect. Man has this innate ability to resolve problems through conflict. And that's going to be something that we need to watch out for. Two, the end of war is an important framework for us is to set up the new Southeast Asia. When Singapore fell, and then eventually war comes to an end in 1945, those years are special years in the sense that they changed the perspective of a whole generation. Now, the politically conscious will say, okay, this is the end of empire. We need to be free. We need to have our own country. All right. Although the man in the street is just trying to survive, but it leads the momentum towards the liberation of Asia. The Japanese had said they invaded Asia and that Asia should be Asia for the Asiatics, but in essence, they were coming in to exploit Asia. But it did provide an intervention that allowed many countries then to actually liberate themselves. Right after Japan surrenders on August 15, the Indonesians, for example, Sukarno on August 17, declares independence from the Dutch, setting off the war of independence against the Dutch, which lasted till 49. You have the same situation arriving in Indochina. And unfortunately, in those cases, the colonial power did not want to leave. The British, to their credit, all right, didn't have to fight a war of liberation against us, although one could say that the communist insurgency was an attempt to do that. There was movement and progress towards political development and eventually a transition. Singaporeans didn't fight a massive war of revolution against the Brits. It was a smooth transition over time that eventually ended up with the independence of Singapore in 1965. And the end of war is reflective of the movement towards independence and the transformation of Southeast Asia. We became not hyphenated states, British Malaya, Dutch East Indies, French Indochina. We became real states. We went through a transition period of learning to understand and live with each other. And today, ASEAN is a relatively peaceful place.
Yeah. This is a very facile question to a very complex answer, but when does Singapore's road to self-rule and independence begin for you? Is it the 15th of August? Is it September the 12th? Is it 1941, 1959? Where does Singapore's road to full independence that leads to SG60, where does it begin for you?
For me, it begins with the stirrings of nationalists in the 1930s itself. But the formal periods are important. What makes that transition to 1965 begins with that road in the 1930s where people were talking about the right to independence and the right to self-governing within the Malay community, within the Chinese community, the arguments between what you would say communist-influenced Chinese schools and KMT-influenced Chinese schools, and the argument as to what is the forward movement to Asia. If you want to go all the way back, it goes back to April 1919, where the Chinese, after the First World War, get shocked by what happens in the Treaty of Versailles and how China is going to be exploited again. And you have the May 4th movement in 1919, and you have in India the Amritsar massacre. Sets these two countries on the trajectory towards independence, and because you had a significant migrant population, the Indians and Chinese in Singapore get affected by the stirrings of Asian nationalism going on in China and India. So you see the influences coming in. But the reality is that after 1945, which was a major shock, in 1942 and 1945, it was a major shock to a person's worldview that European domination is not sanctified by God and that it's not going to be forever, that the real stirrings take place. We have elections here in 1948 for a few seats. So that movement towards a transition is taking place. The willingness to talk about change was taking place, and people were talking about it seriously. And of course, it eventually leads to 1965, our movement out of Malaysia.
A rocky road to get there. A rocky road
too, but
a long and winding road.
Yeah, so you had several milestones on that road that made us. And yes, it is a complex question, although it seems very easy. And it would be very easy for someone who is in national education who will say, "Oh, separation from Malaysia or the First World War." But it was a developed, evolved road that took place, and one has to recognize the complexities that took place in that evolution
and the nuances
and to recognize that there is not one perspective on history, but many different perspectives of history that needs to be recognized and legitimized and acknowledged.
Yeah. We're talking with Jaya Ayyadurai of Singapore History Consultants. Jaya, as we look now at you have done, and others have done, a lot of historical research on the World War II era in Singapore, pre, during, and after. In recent years, we've been talking a lot more about Suk Ching, for example, that has come to the fore in a way that it hadn't for many decades. Where are the pockets now of information or research or understanding that still need to be further looked at when it comes to Singapore and its war history?
When we became independent in 1965 and we set up our own educational process, I remember as a child reading about the Second World War, and the stereotypical perspective was the Chinese experienced the Suk Ching and they suffered greatly. The Indians had both been in the British Indian Army as well as the Indian National Army, slightly confusing, all right? And then the Malays had Lieutenant Adnan, and the fighting that took place at Pasir Panjang Hill. That was a basic stereotypical way of trying to convey that history in a simplistic form. We've got to go beyond that. We are a country that has matured. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're all looking to our doing that navel gazing, and the development of a much more mature history needs to take place.
What does that mean for you?
For example, there are many aspects that have taken place that are not actually talked about.
Like what?
All right. Okay. Let me give you one example. Who were the largest force that defended Singapore and Malaya in 1941-42? What do you think was the largest force?
The Indians?
Yes, very good. Yeah. But you're an informed person.
That's because we had you on the show before.
And of the 137,000 troops, 67,000 were Indian, 39,000 were Brits, 15,000 were Australian, and then you had about 60,000 local forces, 137,000 troops. And yet today when we read world history in that sense, when you talk about the fall of Singapore, generally you get Brit and Australian troops being the face of the war. All right? And that shift towards a more Asian element in the war needs to take place.
That narrative needs to change.
The narrative needs to change. You need to recognize that. So, and sometimes that happens even in when I was a kid. There was a TV show about the war, and you'd get the impression that you had the Sukching, you had the Malay regiment, and then there was nothing about the Indians. Yeah. And so you felt as if the Indians had gone out for tea when the war was taking place, when they were very much a part of it.
Very much a part.
Yeah. So that's one example. Yeah. And I think we need to look at the various different communities and their perspectives of how they came in. Yeah. You could look in terms of who were the people who did, there were many war crimes trials. No one remembers. Everyone thinks about his Japanese war trials. But there were a large number of Koreans and Taiwanese who were also put on trial as part of the Japanese army. It was not a uniform Japanese army. It was an army made up of Japanese, Koreans, and Taiwanese. And if you look at the war records, you find a lot of Korean and Taiwanese names too. So you need to appreciate the regional nature of that conflict. You need to, and we shouldn't, in a sense, demonize people. So, and that creates problems. So in China and in East Asia, for example, the war was like it was fought yesterday. And when I see the various commemorations that take place about the end of war, there are military parades, there are focuses on how we are strong now and we'll hit them hard if they ever came across, and we should always defend ourselves. It's very aggressive. And that's why we set the example that on 12 September, it will be not only Singaporean organizations leading the 12 September ceremony, but we would have the Commonwealth countries and Japan in the committee organizing it, reflecting on how, that these nations who were at war once are now all together in peace, and that and war and commemorations should be about healing the pain, about remembering the sacrifice, about trying to ensure that the same mistakes don't take place again. And that's the messaging that should go, that the nations should be at peace and that war is a terrible mistake.
We're just about out of time, and I could talk to you all day. If someone wants to read more about what you're talking about or watch something, what would be a movie, an exhibition, a museum, or a book that you would recommend that gives a different perspective on what we've talked about in a word or two?
Well, the national museums you should go to, for sure. The Battle Box is a good place to go to. I was director of it time ago.
It was terrific.
It was terrific. But you should read individual accounts, and you should read community accounts of the conflict too, and see it from the perspective of the various other communities that have been silent about it. So the Indian Heritage Center, for example.
And just to appreciate that maybe things that we've read and thought about before might not be the entire story.
Exactly. Now, appreciation that there are lots of things out there that we have not been exposed to yet.
Jaya, we have to leave it there. Thank you for coming to help us commemorate the victory over Japan Day yesterday, the 80th anniversary. We will probably talk to you in September, I would imagine, too.
I would love to have to share a little bit over that. I'm sorry the topic was very heavy, just that you demanded it to be.
I actually find it quite enlightening and uplifting in many ways. Yeah.
Jaya Ayuradai, the Singapore History Consultants, thank you so much for being with us, as always.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.